Wow, you weren't kidding about wanting a deep dive into the future of change management. I'm pretty sure I could build a whole new desk out of the articles and research you sent over.
Yeah, it's a hot topic, that's for sure.
But hey, I'm always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to a topic this important. So let's break down what you really need to know. First of all, I have to admit, I was surprised to learn that change management, as we know it, actually has roots in something called organizational development, or OD. I thought OD was more about, well, making the workplace a better place to be.
Right. Yeah, you're right. OD has traditionally focused on things like improving workplace culture, boosting collaboration, and making sure employees feel valued.
Hmm.
And it's been around a lot longer than the kind of change management we associate with specific projects or initiatives.
So is change management just OD on fast forward? Like, we need to make this change now, so let's use these techniques to get people on board quickly.
It's tempting to see it that way, but the real difference is in the time frame. OD is about ongoing improvement, constantly evolving the organization. Change management is more focused on getting from point A to point B on a specific initiative.
Okay, that makes sense. But it makes me wonder if OD is all about creating a healthy, adaptable organization. Why did we even need change management to become a separate thing?
It's a bit like this. Imagine OD is like building a strong, flexible foundation for a house. That foundation allows you to make changes, add rooms, remodel, without the whole structure collapsing. But sometimes you need to make specific, targeted changes quickly, and that's where change management comes in.
So it's less about creating a healthy culture and more about getting people to accept a specific change, even if it's happening fast.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most popular models in change management, Lowen's unfreeze, change, refreeze. But here's the thing, that refreeze idea might actually be holding us back.
Wait, seriously? But unfreeze, change, refreeze is practically the motto of every change management seminar I've ever attended. Are you saying it's all wrong?
Not entirely, but it's a classic case of taking a simple model and applying it in a way it was never intended. Luma was actually studying child psychology, how behaviors stabilize at new levels over time. It wasn't about organizations literally freezing in place.
You're saying that this refreeze idea, which so many of us learn in Change Management 101, is actually holding us back, that we need to be thinking more about continuous evolution.
That's a great way to put it. It's not about reaching a static endpoint and staying there. The modern workplace is all about finding a dynamic equilibrium. You're always adapting, learning, and finding new levels of stability, but it's a continuous process.
Okay, that's a real aha moment for me. No wonder so many organizations struggle with change if they're thinking about it as this one and done event instead of an ongoing process. So where do we go from here? If traditional change management isn't cutting it, what are our options?
That's the million-dollar question. We have these established fields, OD with its focus on people, CM with its emphasis on adoption, and of course, project management, or PM, which is all about hitting those deadlines and deliverables. The key is figuring out how they all work together.
So it's like assembling a team of superheroes. OD is the wise strategist, CM is the smooth talker who gets everyone on board, and PM is the one who makes sure things actually get done. But how do they actually work together in the real world?
Imagine you're trying to implement a big change, like adopting AI in your factories. This is where a framework called Strengths-Driven Framework, or SDF, comes in. Think of it as having three layers.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through those layers.
The first layer is the foundation where OD comes in. It's about establishing a shared set of values, a strong culture of trust and collaboration. Think of a global company with offices all over the world. Each office might have its own way of working, but there's a common thread that connects them, a shared understanding of, this is how we do things here.
So even if teams are working on different projects, even in different countries, they're all operating from the same basic playbook.
Exactly. And this foundation is crucial because in a networked organization, you don't have that traditional hierarchy dictating every decision. You need people to be aligned on the bigger picture.
All right, so OD sets the stage. What about the next layer?
That's where project management takes center stage. We call this the execution layer. It's about having scalable, efficient processes that can be adapted to different parts of the network. Instead of one giant rigid plan, you have smaller, more flexible projects that can be rolled out in a coordinated way.
So if we go back to your AI-powered factory example, each factory might have its own implementation timeline and specific needs, but the overall project is managed in a way that keeps everything moving forward.
You got it. And that brings us to the final layer, integration, where change management shines. It's all about making sure people are equipped to handle the change, that they feel supported, that they understand how this all fits into the bigger picture.
So going back to those AI-powered factories, this is where you'd provide personalized training for each worker, making sure they understand how to use the new technology and how it impacts their job.
Exactly. You're making sure that the human element isn't forgotten amidst all the technical changes.
Mm.
It's about supporting people through the transition, addressing their concerns, and making sure they feel like they're part of the solution.
This all sounds amazing, but let's be real, what could go wrong? I mean, change is inherently risky, right? How does SDF handle that?
That's where it gets really interesting. Traditional risk management is often about control, trying to predict and prevent every possible problem. But in a networked organization, you need to be more flexible, more adaptable.
So how do you balance caution with agility? On the one hand, you don't want to just throw caution to the wind and hope for the best, but on the other hand, you don't want to get so bogged down in risk assessments that you can't move forward.
Exactly. And this tension plays out in how OD, CM, and PM each view risk. OD, with its long-term focus, is looking for systemic risks that could impact the overall health of the organization. Things like cultural misalignment or a lack of trust.
CM being focused on adoption is probably worried about resistance, like what if people just refuse to use the new system?
Exactly. Their risk is that people won't get on board or that the change won't stick. And then we have PM, who's all about hitting those deadlines and staying within budget. So their risks are things like delays, cost overruns, and scope creep.
Okay, so we've got these three different perspectives on risk. How do we bring them together in a way that makes sense for SDF?
That's where the idea of a harmonizer comes in.
Ooh, this sounds intriguing. Is this like a change management Jedi Master? What exactly does a harmonizer do?
Think of it as someone who makes sure that OD, CM, and PM are all working in sync, that their approaches to risk complement each other rather than clash.
So this harmonizer needs to be a bit of a jack of all trades. They need to understand people processes and be able to see the big picture.
You could say that they need a solid understanding of all three disciplines, but they also need to be really good at communication collaboration and navigating those tricky tensions between control and flexibility.
Wow, this sounds like a pretty demanding role. Is this an actual job title or is it more of a concept?
It's both. We're starting to see harmonizer pop up as a job title, but it could also evolve from existing roles like the network weaver we'll discuss later on. The key takeaway here is that someone or even a team needs to be responsible for making sure those three disciplines work together smoothly.
Okay, so we've got our superhero team, ODCM and PM, all working together under the watchful eye of the harmonizer. But let's be practical here. We can't just throw around fancy terms and expect everything to magically fall into place. How do organizations actually implement SDF in a way that works for them?
That's where things get really interesting because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Every organization is different with its own unique culture, structure, and goals.
Because what works for a giant multinational corporation probably isn't going to work for a small startup, right?
Exactly. So let's explore some different options. One approach is what we call the extended network weaver role.
Okay, so this builds on that network weaver idea you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. This approach is a good fit for smaller, more agile organizations. The network weaver, who's already plugged into the network's dynamics, takes on the additional responsibility of making sure ODCM and PM are working in harmony.
So they're like the conductor of the SDF orchestra, making sure everyone is playing the right notes at the right time.
That's a great analogy. They're facilitating communication, helping teams navigate challenges, and making sure that the long-term vision isn't lost in the day-to-day hustle.
All right, that's option one. What about larger organizations that might need a bit more structure?
For them, option two might be a better fit: the dedicated harmonizer. This is a standalone role, someone who's completely focused on making sure SDF is implemented effectively throughout the organization.
So it's their full-time job, no distractions, no competing priorities, just pure SDF awesomeness.
That's the idea. They're the go-to person for anything related to SDF, providing guidance, troubleshooting, and keeping everyone aligned. It's a big responsibility, but it can be incredibly effective in larger organizations.
Okay, that makes sense. But
Right.
what if you have a company that's, well, massive? Multiple departments global reach the whole 9 yards. How do you implement SDF at that scale?
For those giants, we have a couple more options. Option three is to have separate teams for ODCM and PM, each with their own expertise.
So instead of having one person or a small team trying to juggle everything, you have specialists in each area who can really dive deep.
Exactly. They might have their own team leaders, their own projects, but they're constantly communicating and collaborating to make sure everything is aligned with the overall SDF strategy.
Okay, I can see how that would work. But I also imagine it could get messy. with so many moving parts, how do you keep everyone on the same page?
That's the challenge. You need really strong communication channels, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and a culture that truly values collaboration.
So it's not just about having the right structure in place, it's about having the right mindset throughout the organization.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And that brings us to our final option, which is perhaps the most ambitious. We call it diffused expertise.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this diffused expertise thing.
In this model, each network team has people who are responsible for ODCM and PM aspects within their team. They might not be specialists, but they have enough knowledge and training to handle those functions for their specific team.
So instead of having dedicated teams or individuals, you're essentially embedding those skills throughout the entire network.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where everyone is equipped to handle change, where ODCM and PM are simply part of how work gets done.
This sounds amazing in theory, but I can see it being challenging. I mean, it requires a very high level of trust and collaboration, right?
You're absolutely right. This approach requires a very strong culture of collaboration. Everyone needs to be on the same page, willing to share knowledge, and comfortable working across traditional boundaries.
So not for the faint of heart. But I can see how in the right organization, this could be incredibly powerful.
Exactly. And that's the key takeaway here. There's no one right way to implement SDF. It all comes down to your specific context, your culture, and your goals.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the limitations of traditional approaches to change management and introduced SDF as a more flexible and adaptable framework. We've also talked about the different ways organizations can implement SDF based on their specific needs. But before we move on, I want to address something that I know is probably on your mind. What about those big, infrequent changes that every organization faces? The kind that throws everyone for a loop, no matter how agile you are.
You're talking about what we call episodic change. And you're right, those big disruptive events can be a real challenge, even for organizations that have embraced SDF.
So what do we do? Do we just abandon SDF altogether when those big changes hit?
Not at all.
Oh.
SDF can actually help you navigate episodic change more effectively, but it requires a slight adjustment.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the SDF playbook for handling those big, scary changes.
Think of SDF as being like staying in shape. You exercise regularly, eat healthy, and you're generally in good condition.
Okay, I'm following you so far.
But then you decide to run a marathon. That's a big one-time event that requires a different kind of training. You're not going to abandon your healthy habits. You're going to adapt them to meet the demands of the marathon.
So how does that translate to SDF and episodic change?
Let's say your organization is going through a major merger. That's a huge shift that's going to impact everyone. Instead of trying to handle it with your existing network teams, you assemble a temporary team, a kind of special ops unit, with the specific skills and experience to navigate that merger.
So you're drawing on the strengths of your network, but you're creating a dedicated team for that specific challenge, like assembling the Avengers to handle a world-ending threat.
Exactly. This team might include people from different departments, different levels of seniority, and you might even bring in outside experts to provide guidance.
And what happens once the merger is complete? Does this special ops team just disband, fade back into the shadows?
They do, but not before they've shared their knowledge and experience with the rest of the network. Remember, SDF is all about continuous learning. So this episodic change becomes an opportunity to strengthen the network as a whole.
All right, that makes sense. So SDF isn't just about handling the day-to-day changes. It's also about equipping organizations to tackle those big, infrequent disruptions that inevitably come along.
Exactly, and that's what makes it such a powerful framework. It's not about rigid rules or one-size-fits-all solutions. It's about adapting, learning, and leveraging your strengths to thrive in a world of constant change.
This is all incredibly insightful. I think we've done a great job of laying the groundwork here. We've explored the limitations of traditional change management, introduced the SDF framework, and even talked about how to handle those big episodic changes. But there's one more elephant in the room that we need to address before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
And what would that be?
Remote work. It's changing the way we work, the way we communicate, and even the way we think about organizations. So how does all of this remote work craziness impact SDF?
That's a great question, and one that we'll dive into deeper in part 2 of our deep dive. Join us next time as we explore the challenges and opportunities of implementing SDF in a world where remote work is becoming the new normal.
Welcome back. I'm ready to keep unpacking this whole strengths-driven framework thing, especially now that we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how it actually works in a world where so many people are working remotely.
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot.
Yeah.
On the surface, you might think remote work is a perfect fit for SDF. After all, networks are all about distributed teams, flexible communication, working across boundaries.
It's like remote work was made for this kind of flexible, adaptable organization, right?
Yeah. You could definitely argue that, in a way, remote work is pushing organizations to adopt the very principles that SDF promotes. It forces them to rethink traditional hierarchies, to become more agile,
Mm.
more reliant on technology, more focused on outcomes. But
Yeah.
there's a catch.
I knew there had to be a catch. What's the downside?
Well, SDF relies heavily on strong relationships, that sense of community and shared purpose we talked about earlier. And building those relationships can be a lot harder when you're not physically together.
Yeah, I get that. When you're working remotely, it's easy to feel isolated. You miss out on those casual interactions, the hallway conversations, the coffee breaks where you actually get to know your colleagues as people.
Exactly. And those informal interactions are crucial for building trust and rapport. It's one thing to collaborate with someone on a project. It's another thing to feel like you genuinely understand them, that you can rely on them, that you have their back.
So, how do you build that kind of trust when you're working with people you might never actually meet in person? It feels like a recipe for miscommunication and conflict.
It can be if you're not careful. That's why it's so important to be intentional about how you communicate in a remote environment. It's not just about having the right tools. It's about using those tools effectively to build connections.
So, it's not enough to just have Slack and Zoom. You need a strategy for actually using them in a way that fosters those relationships.
Precisely. Think about it this way. When you're working in an office, those casual interactions happen organically. You bump into someone in the hallway, you grab lunch together, you chat by the coffee machine. In a remote environment, you need to create those opportunities intentionally.
So, how do you do that? Do you schedule mandatory virtual coffee breaks, force people to attend online happy hours?
It's not about forcing people to socialize. It's about creating a space where it feels natural and comfortable to connect. Encourage teams to have virtual coffee breaks, to share personal updates, to get to know each other beyond just their work roles.
So, it's about recreating those water cooler moments, but in a virtual way.
Exactly. And it's not just about scheduled events. Encourage people to use instant messaging for those quick check-ins, to share a funny meme or an interesting article. It's about creating a sense of community and connection, even if it's happening online.
Okay, I'm starting to see how you can make these work. But what about the harmonizer role we talked about earlier? How does that work in a remote environment? I mean, if they're trying to build alignment and collaboration between teams that are scattered all over the place, it seems like it would be incredibly difficult.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. Remember, those harmonizers need to have a deep understanding of all three disciplines, OD, CM, and PM, and they need to be able to navigate the tension between control and flexibility. In a remote environment, those skills become even more important.
So, how do you find someone who can do all of that and do it well when they're working remotely? It seems like an almost impossible task.
It's not impossible, but it does require a different approach. When you're interviewing for a harmonizer role in a remote organization, you need to look beyond just their technical skills and experience. You need to assess their communication skills, their emotional intelligence, their ability to build relationships virtually.
So, you're looking for someone who's not only a change management expert, but also a master of virtual communication and relationship building. That narrows down the field considerably.
It does, but finding the right person is crucial. Remember, those harmonizers are the glue that holds the SDF network together.
Mm.
They need to be able to build trust and rapport with people they might never actually meet in person.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of communication and the challenges of finding the right harmonizer. What else do organizations need to consider when implementing SDF in a remote environment?
Another key area is training. And I'm not just talking about technical skills training, but training specifically on how to work effectively in a remote or hybrid team, how to communicate clearly, how to manage conflict, how to build those relationships we were just talking about.
So it's not enough to just give people the tools and tell them to figure it out. You need to actually equip them with the skills they need to not only do their jobs remotely, but also to thrive in a networked environment.
You've got it. This training needs to be ongoing, not just a one-time thing. The world of work is changing so rapidly, we need to be constantly learning and adapting.
Okay, so communication training, anything else? What about those times when you really do need to get people together in person? Is there still a place for face-to-face interaction in an SDF world, or is that just old school thinking?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
And honestly, I think there's still a lot of value in face-to-face interactions, even if your organization is primarily remote. But it's about being strategic and intentional with those in-person gatherings.
Okay, so you're not advocating for a return to the 5-day-a-week office grind.
Not at all. But think about those key moments that really benefit from face-to-face interaction. For example, when you're kicking off a new project or when you're having a strategic planning session. Those are times when being physically together can really make a difference.
So it's not about being in the office for the sake of being in the office. It's about using those in-person moments strategically to strengthen those network connections.
Exactly. And it's not just about work either.
Mhm.
Think about team building activities, social events, those opportunities to connect on a personal level. Because remember, strong relationships are the foundation of a successful network, whether it's virtual, in-person, or hybrid.
All right, so we've got some practical solutions for making SDF work in a remote world, but I have to admit, I'm still feeling a bit skeptical. Is all of this really feasible? I mean, it's one thing to talk about these ideals, but how do organizations actually make it happen in the real world? It seems like such a huge cultural shift.
It is a big shift. You're right about that. And it's not going to be easy. It requires a real change in mindset, a willingness to challenge those traditional notions of control and hierarchy.
Because SDF isn't just about implementing a new framework, it's about changing the culture, right? It's about how people think and how they interact with each other.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that's why leadership is so crucial. Leaders need to not only understand SDF, but also embody its principles. They need to be comfortable with distributed authority. They need to be champions of collaboration, and they need to create an environment where everyone feels empowered to contribute.
So if the leaders aren't on board, SDF is basically doomed.
It's going to be a lot harder, that's for sure.
Mm.
Because remember, culture starts at the top. If the leaders are still clinging to those traditional command and control methods, it's going to be very difficult to create that network of trust and empowerment that SDF requires.
So what can leaders do to actually lead in a way that supports SDF? What does that look like in practice?
It starts with letting go. Leaders need to be willing to give up some of that control, to trust their teams, to make decisions, to experiment, to even fail occasionally. Because remember, failure is an opportunity for learning.
Easier said than done right. Especially for leaders who are used to being well in control, it's a big ask.
It is, but the rewards can be huge. When you empower your people, when you create that environment of trust and collaboration, you unleash a level of creativity and innovation that you could never achieve with a top-down approach.
So it's not just about doing SDF, it's about being SDF. It's about changing the way you think and the way you lead.
You've got it.
Yeah.
It needs to be woven into the DNA of the organization. It needs to be how you operate, how you think, how you make decisions.
Okay. So leadership is crucial.
Hmm.
But what about the rest of us? What can we do to support SDF, even if we're not in a leadership position? Do we just sit back and wait for our boss to get on board?
Absolutely not. Everyone has a role to play. First and foremost, be curious.
Mm.
Learn about SDF, understand its principles, and think about how it could be applied in your own work.
So even if my organization isn't officially implementing SDF, I can still adopt those principles in my own team or department.
Exactly. Start small.
Yeah.
Experiment. Share your knowledge with others, because even if you're not the CEO, you can still be a change agent within your own sphere of influence.
I love that. So it's not just about wording for permission, it's about taking initiative and showing that SDF can work.
That's the spirit. The more people who embrace those principles, the more likely it is that the organization as a whole will start to shift in that direction.
This is all really inspiring. It feels like we're talking about a whole new way of working a way that's more adaptable, more collaborative, and ultimately more human. But there's one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up this episode: sustainability. We've talked about how SDF can help organizations adapt to change. But how do we make sure those changes actually stick? How do we create a culture where change isn't just something we endure, but something we embrace and learn from?
That's the ultimate goal, isn't it? And it all comes back to those core principles of SDF. If you've created a strong network of trust and empowerment, if you're constantly learning and adapting, if you're valuing those diverse perspectives, then change becomes, well, almost second nature.
Because it's no longer seen as a threat, it's seen as an opportunity. Like, bring on the change. We've got this.
Exactly. And when you reach that point, when change is simply part of how you operate, then you've achieved something truly remarkable. You've created an organization that's not just surviving change, but thriving on it.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. But I also have to admit, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. We've covered so much ground today. How do I even begin to process all of this information?
That's a valid feeling. And I think it's important to remember that SDF isn't something you implement overnight. It's a journey. It's a process of continuous learning and adaptation.
So don't try to boil the ocean, right? Start small, focus on one area, and then build from there.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are resources available, communities of practice people who have been down this road before. Reach out, connect, and learn from each other.
All right, that's reassuring. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm feeling hopeful. Change can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. With the right mindset, the right tools, and the right support, we can create organizations that are not just adaptable, but truly thriving in this ever-changing world.
Indeed. And in our final part, we'll take all of this and give you concrete steps to make it happen. Join us as we explore the practical side of putting SDF into action.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the future of change management. Feels like we've covered so much ground already,
Without.
from the history of change management to the ins and outs of the strengths-driven framework.
Absolutely.
But, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So let's shift our focus from theory to practice.
Yeah, let's do it.
Our listeners are probably thinking, okay, I get this whole SDF thing,
Yeah.
but how do I actually make it happen in my organization? So let's get into that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what we're here to answer. So let's imagine you've decided to embrace SDF.
Mhm.
You've chosen the implementation method that best fits your organization, whether it's the harmonizer role, separate teams, or the, integrated diffused expertise model. What are those first steps? What do you actually do?
Well, I'd imagine it's a bit like renovating a house.
Hmm.
You can't just tear down all the walls and expect to live there comfortably. You need a plan, a process, and probably a good contractor or two.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights one of the biggest mistakes organizations make when implementing SDF. They try to do too much too soon.
Mhm.
They get excited about the concept, but they underestimate the effort required to actually make it a reality.
So you're saying don't try to boil the ocean, start small, focus on one area, and build from there.
Exactly. And remember, SBF is a journey, not a destination.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you start by piloting SDF with one team, or you focus on improving collaboration between two departments that are already, interconnected.
So it's about proving the concept, showing that SDF can work in your specific context, and then building momentum from there.
Precisely. And this ties into another critical point, communication. It's
Oh.
essential throughout the entire process.
Ah, yes, the classic communication breakdown. It's the root of so many organizational problems.
Absolutely. And when you're implementing a change as significant as SDF, communication becomes even more vital because you're not just changing processes, you're changing the culture, the way people think and work.
So you need to be upfront about why you're making this change, address people's concerns, and make sure everyone feels like they're part of the process.
Absolutely. It's not about sending out a company-wide email announcing, we're now an SDF organization. It's about having ongoing conversations, listening to feedback, and making adjustments along the way.
So it's not just about talking at people, it's about having a dialogue, a two-way conversation where everyone feels heard and understood.
You got it. And it's not just about words. It's about actions. Leaders need to walk the talk.
Mm.
They need to embody those SDF principles in their own behavior.
Because if they're saying one thing but doing another, people are going to see right through it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Authenticity is key. People can tell when you're genuinely committed to something. So leaders need to be role models for the behaviors they want to see in their organization.
Okay, so we've got start small, communicate effectively, any other pearls of wisdom for those brave souls embarking on this SDF journey.
One final thought. Be patient.
Mm.
Real change takes time. You're not going to transform your organization overnight.
Mm-hmm.
There will be bumps in the road. There will be moments of frustration. But if you stick with it, if you keep learning and adapting, you'll eventually reach that point where SDF becomes just how you do things.
That's reassuring because honestly, it can feel a bit daunting. Like, how do we even begin to make this happen? But you're right, it's a process, not an event.
Exactly. And don't forget, you don't have to go it alone. There are resources available. There are communities of practice. There are people who've already implemented SDF.
Yeah.
Reach out, connect, learn from their experiences.
Okay, I'm feeling more confident now. But let's bring it back to our listeners. They've given us their time. They've listened to us ramble on about SDF for 3 whole episodes. What's the one key takeaway we want them to walk away with?
I think the future of change management is not about finding the perfect model. It's about finding the approach that works best for your organization, your people, and your unique goals.
And that approach might be SDF or it might be something else entirely. But the key is to be proactive, to embrace change as an opportunity, and to empower your people to be part of the solution.
Right, and to remember that change is constant. The organizations that thrive are the ones that can adapt and evolve.
Hmm.
So stay curious, keep learning, and never be afraid to experiment.
That's great advice. On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the future of change management. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep diving, keep learning, and keep changing.